Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the one true and living Mario Brothers game. Now, I'm going to respond to a video by Inspiring Philosophy, but before I do, I want to set the table a little bit. In my video number McClellan 1909, I responded to an earlier video by Inspiring Philosophy in which they argued that it is not the no true Scotsman fallacy to insist that Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and other progressive Christians aren't real Christians. And in my video, I suggested that they were misrepresenting what a no true Scotsman fallacy is, because just saying Mormons aren't Christians isn't a fallacy at all. It's an assertion. For it to be the no true Scotsman fallacy, there has to be a specific progression to the argument. You begin with a generalization like Christians believe in the Trinity. Then somebody provides a counterexample that undermines that generalization, like Mormons are Christians, they don't believe in the Trinity, and then you have to revise the generalization arbitrarily. And what that means is you change the generalization from Christians to something like true Christians or real Christians or genuine Christians or something like that. And it is a fallacy because it arbitrarily arrogates the prerogative to declare what real, true, or genuine Christianity is without argument. Now, let's get to Inspiring Philosophy's response.
So this creator has assumed that one aspect of the no true Scotsman fallacy is the full understanding. And if that was the case, the following example would also be a no true Scotsman fallacy. Person C says, no vegan eats steak. Person D says, but my Uncle Angus is a vegan and he eats steak, but no true vegan eats steak. If the fallacy was just a generalization being altered to exclude a counterexample, we'd have to conclude that person C also committed the fallacy. But they're correct, because the definition of a vegan excludes someone who eats steak. They have a meaningful reason to exclude Uncle Angus in this case.
So two things here. First, they absolutely committed the no true Scotsman fallacy. Just because your conclusion is accurate does not mean your argument cannot be a fallacy. And just because your argument is fallacious does not mean that your conclusion is falsified or wrong. That fundamentally misunderstands the nature of informal fallacies. Because they're not saying, oh, well, let's take a look at how we understand what a vegan is, how people typically use the word vegan, and you can see that your uncle is not actually a vegan. That would be providing an argument. But to respond to my Uncle Angus is a vegan and he eats steak by saying, well, no true vegan eats steak, is changing the boundaries of the claim arbitrarily by presuming to have the prerogative to dictate the difference between true veganism and false veganism. That's the arbitrariness, that's the change, that's the fallacy. So it is absolutely a fallacy, even if you have an accurate conclusion, to use a fallacious argument like, well, no true vegan eats steak. And this brings up the second thing. This is not an accurate conclusion, because being vegan is a social identity, and this doesn't even scratch the surface of the complexity of social identities. Some people don't feel comfortable observing veganism around family or friends or colleagues or their bosses or something like that. They may feel that they need to perform the consumption of meat in certain circumstances. Some people struggle with it and they identify as vegan and they try hard, but sometimes they are weak. Just like the other example that Flew gives for the no true Scotsman fallacy, somebody who commits sexual crimes is not a true Scotsman because true Scotsmen don't do that. Well, there are imperfect Scotsmen out there, just like there are imperfect vegans out there. And so to try to reduce this to this single necessary and sufficient feature, as if this definition somehow metaphysically governs people's ability to identify as vegans, is absolutely incorrect.
And philosophers do point out the fallacy is committed when the identified feature is arbitrary or ad hoc. This is from the book Critical Thinking by Stuart Hanscom, and he says the desperation of such a maneuver is pretty clear. But in technical terms, the arguer has reestablished the validity of the argument by arbitrarily changing the definition of what he is arguing about. This is Thinking Better by Andrew D. Chapman, and he says the no true Scotsman fallacy is an informal logical fallacy that occurs when the definition of a term is arbitrarily adjusted to exclude a counterexample. And of course, we can go see what Anthony Flew himself says in A Dictionary of Philosophy, and he says, the danger and the appeal of this maneuver is that the maneuverer may persuade himself and others that this piece of arbitrary redefinition has shown the original contingent contention, after all, not to be false. So the identified feature has to be arbitrary or ad hoc, otherwise no fallacy was committed.
So now Inspiring Philosophy has fundamentally misrepresented all three of the sources that they cited. Those three sources talked about an arbitrary redefinition. And in a no true Scotsman fallacy, that arbitrary redefinition is the qualification of the original generalization by adding true or real or genuine. So in the example of the vegan, the original generalization is no vegan eats steak. The arbitrary redefinition is no true vegan, no real vegan, no genuine vegan eats steak. Now, even if that is accurate, it's still a fallacy because it's not an argument. It's just an arbitrary assertion that you have the prerogative to declare real or true or genuine veganism. Now, you may have an argument to back it up, but you need to provide the argument. Just saying no true, real, or genuine vegan eats steak is not an argument. It is an assertion. It is arbitrary. Now, Inspiring Philosophy wants to understand the arbitrary redefinition to refer to the necessary and sufficient features that were a part of the original generalization. No vegan eats steak. They don't eat steak. That's the necessary and sufficient feature of veganism. That's not the arbitrary redefinition. That's the original generalization. The arbitrary redefinition is the assertion that no true, real, or genuine vegan eats steak. So in the example of Christianity, if you start with the necessary and sufficient feature, Christians believe X, Y, and Z, you've already asserted the definition. And whether it is arbitrary or meaningful or whatever is irrelevant if you then alter the generalization by arbitrarily asserting true, genuine, real Christians believe X, Y, and Z. That is the arbitrary redefinition, the addition of true, real, genuine, because that is an arbitrary declaration of what constitutes real, true, genuine Christianity without an argument. If you say Christians believe X, Y, and Z, what about Mormons? They're Christians, they don't believe X, Y, and Z. And then you explain, well, here's why I think we can look at history and see that Christianity has always considered these things to be fundamental to Christian identity. That's providing an argument. That is not an arbitrary redefinition. So Inspiring Philosophy has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this fallacy and fundamentally misrepresented all three of the sources that they cited.
If I were to say all Christians believe in the Trinity and someone replied, well, Mormons are Christians and they don't believe in the Trinity, I'm not committing a fallacy because I have a meaningful reason to say they're not real Christians, not an arbitrary reason.
Well, that depends entirely on how you respond, and you have provided no response in this example. If person A responds by saying, well, here are my reasons for identifying belief in the Trinity as a necessary and sufficient feature of Christian identity, then no, you're not committing the no true Scotsman fallacy. If person A responds, tut tut, all true Christians believe in the Trinity, you are 100% committing the no true Scotsman fallacy, because it does not matter how meaningful your understanding of the necessary and sufficient features of Christian identity are if your response is just to arbitrarily dictate what a true Christian is without argument. That is the crux of the fallacy.
Now, of course, the counter to that is to say, well, couldn't Mormons come up with a definition of what it is to be a Christian that excludes Trinitarians? And the answer is yes. But neither group has to accept the other's definition.
So now we're getting into the circular reasoning, which is going to have to be the topic of another response.